Good morning. It's time to begin our Bible study period this morning. We want to welcome everybody that's here. In case you're wondering why I'm standing up here, since several of us have seen Tim, Tim's got a tooth that's bothering him, and he kind of warned me ahead of time, so I figured I'd give him a little break and go ahead and fill in the class. I asked him to put some of my class notes up here because I've got some prompts about some things I wanted to talk to, and then as I was sitting down here thinking, I thought, well, Al, that wasn't too smart because Tim's program probably had the answers on it. but we'll get through it the best we can this morning. Before we begin, I've asked Tim Taylor to lead us in a word of prayer.
Father, as we come before you, we are thankful for all the blessings that you bestow down upon us. We are mindful of those blessings, and we hope that we will never take those things for granted and use them as you would have us to use them to spread your word. We ask that you be with those that are less fortunate than we are, and continue to watch over them and be with us that we might share your word with them, that they might be turned from their ways and be brought to you. We ask that you be with those of our number that are sick, that you will comfort them and be with us, that we might do the things that would help them in any way that we can. We ask that you be with the doctors that are about to take care of Max and the surgery that he's about to undertake, and guide their hands that they'll do just the things that will cause him to be restored to his health and placed back here with us. Watch over us now as we go into this study. Be with Al as he delivers it to us, that we can all learn much from your word. It's our prayer in Christ's name. Amen.
All right, so we're on lesson 2 in our book concerning the conquest, the campaigns for Palestine. The author starts out here, 40 years after leaving Egypt, the descendants of Abraham entered the land he had received as an inheritance. It was the promised land. God had delivered the nation from their captives, delivered the nation from their captivity, this was in Egypt, and brought them safely into Canaan, a land inhabited by many small nations. The Lord told Joshua to utterly destroy every Canaanite inhabitant. And our lesson this week is Joshua's account of this command's fulfillment. The next paragraph started out, the Passover was upon them, and the Lord charged that they should observe it. Yet under the penalty of death, no uncircumcised man could participate. If you remember, when we studied Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy, we saw that there was restrictions upon who could celebrate the Passover. And one of these restrictions, that if you were not circumcised, you could not participate in it. Therefore, Joshua circumcised every Israelite that had not been circumcised during the years of wandering. And we read about this in chapter 5, verses 2 through 9. He called the place Gilgal, the rolling away, which was the nation's first camp within the boundaries of Canaan. The Israelites had crossed the Jordan. We studied about this last week, and this was their first encampment. One interesting point here that the author did not make, in the 5th chapter of Joshua, in verse 12, we read this, and I'll be, let's see. I'll be reading from the English Standard Version. Starting with chapter 5, verse 11. And the day after the Passover, on that very day, they, the Israelites, ate of the produce of the land, unleavened cakes and parched grain. And the manna ceased the day after they ate of the produce of the land, and there was no longer manna for the people of Israel, but they ate of the fruit of the land of Canaan that year. You know, manna was something that we read about shortly after the Israelites left Egypt, when they got to grumbling about food, one of many times, and the Lord sent them this manna that had sustained them on a daily basis from that time, Exodus 16, prior to them arriving at Mount Sinai. That manna had sustained them on a daily basis from then all through this 40 years till now, and they entered the Canaan land, when they entered the land of Canaan. One other note, or one other question that I had about this section was, we noticed that the Lord here told them to celebrate Passover. And the thought occurred to me as I was reading that, had the Israelites celebrated Passover all the years of the wandering? Now, that may seem a strange place to go, but when I read this, you know, we don't often see about Passover being celebrated. We do know from our study, you know, today, that before the Passover could be celebrated in Canaan, that this generation that had not been circumcised needed to be circumcised. Now, circumcision, we'll remember, was a sign of God's covenant with Abraham. So it had been instituted long ago. And my thought process was, well, Caleb and Joshua were still alive, of that number that left Egypt. All of the males that had been born in Egypt but that were not yet 20 years old should have been circumcised. So there was plenty of people during that 40 years to celebrate Passover. When we looked at our study of the Passover, you know, we noticed that this was to be a memorial, a continual memorial before the people. And it was to be celebrated on the 14th day of the month, of the first month. You know, we read about in Numbers. In Deuteronomy, they're once more reminded to remember the Passover. So I'm not sure what the answer to my question really was, but just, pardon? Well, I want us to think about things, and I think it's valuable when we think about things to see what answers we can come from the Scripture. Well, here's my answer then, that I don't know for sure if they celebrated Passover during the wandering. We know that there was people that was, I'll use the term scripturally able to celebrate Passover during that time. That tells us whether they did or not? No. I could not find any reference to it in Genesis through Deuteronomy. All right, moving on. All right, we talked about the manna stopping. Getting started. We talked about the circumcision. All that remained was for Israel to conquer the inhabitants of their inheritance. Getting started, and the author asks him some questions here, and as Tim pointed out the other night, the author of this workbook kind of asks us questions to get us to thinking about what's going to come up next. And some of these questions you can go ahead and look a little farther on in the lesson to find the author's answer of it. But I think it's a good practice when we come to these sections to do all the research we can to answer the questions before we see what the author says. You know, let's look for scriptural answers to the author's questions. The first question that the author asks us here: what was Joshua's greatest tool in defeating the idolatrous inhabitants of Canaan? How would we answer that? Okay, Tim Taylor says God. I agree with that answer. Okay, Tim added, and the sword. Okay. Lynn answered his faith. I think that's an acceptable answer. Pardon? Okay, his Joshua's seemingly unquestionable faith. And we've seen that, we talked about that last week, how Joshua's training period, if you will, helped develop that faith. His own belief in what God said developed that faith. Other terms we might use or thoughts we might have. Okay, his courage. Okay, he was told in several passages to be strong and courageous. The only other thing that I put down there was Joshua's obedience in obeying the Lord in all these circumstances. All right. List the 3 campaigns that make up the conquest and generally identify those defeated by Israel. What were the 3 campaigns that make up the land, that make up the conquest of this land? The first one, the early campaign. Okay, if we had a map of the land of Canaan up here that Tim may have had in his program too, we had a map of the land of Canaan up here, we would see where Israel crossed the Jordan River, just about the middle of the land of Canaan. Okay, and they were at Gilgal now. So this early campaign, we're going to see him dealing with or the Israelites dealing, God dealing with the city-states of this region in the center part of the land of Canaan. And we're gonna look at him dealing with Jericho this morning. We're gonna look at him dealing with Ai this morning. I don't think we'll get there this morning, but we'll look at the incident with the Gibeonites that all compose this early campaign. Pardon? Page 13, Billy says there is a map. And yes, there is. Okay. What's the next campaign then? What's the next part of this conquering of the land that we're going to see? Okay, the southern portion of the land. And again, if you look at this map on page 13, you're going to see this orange line, and it goes through various towns, cities, if you will. And most of these are named. We'll see the Israelites dealing with the 5 kings of the Amorites, and the king of Jerusalem, the king of Hebron, the king of Jarmuth, and Lachish are specifically named in them. If you go on down through chapter 10, you're going to see Machirah, Libnah. Again, we see Lachish in verse 31. We see Gezer in verse 33. We see Eglon in verse 34. Hebron, that we've already mentioned, from verse 36. And Deber in verse 38. Okay, so we've covered the center, and we've covered then the southern portion of the land of Canaan here. Next, obviously, we're going to move north. We read about the northern campaign generally starting in verse 11. We see him dealing with a king Jabin Halor. Jobab Madden talks about the kings of Simeon and Ashva. And if you're looking at that map on page 13, you can follow the track that the author has laid out here for that. Some of the towns that are mentioned are on this map. We won't see reference to till later in Joshua. We'll see the city of Tyre mentioned in the 19th chapter, and the city of Sidon also mentioned in the 19th chapter. All right. The next question. What king would later violate Joshua's covenant with the Gibeonites? What was the king's name that violated this covenant? Saul, okay, King Saul, the first king of what we will study as the period of the United Kingdom of Israel. So Saul violates this covenant that Joshua made with the Gibeonites, and the second part of the question is, how would it be restored? And I might ask, who restored it? Okay, David restored it, and here were the conditions of this, in case you didn't read it, from 2 Samuel chapter 21, starting in verse 5. So they said to the king, and this was David, the man, Saul, who consumed us and who planned to exterminate us from remaining within any border of Israel, let 7 men from his sons be given to us, and we will hang them before the Lord in Gibeah of Saul, the chosen of the Lord. And the king said, I will give them. So we see Saul violating this covenant and the execution of his sons and some grandsons here to atone for that. All right, let's go here. The walls came tumbling down. And for those of you who are following in the workbook, we're on page number 8 here. From Joshua chapter 6, verses 1 through 27, we see here the account of Jericho falling before the Israelites. This is an account that many of us have studied and have talked about in Bible classes from a very young age. But let's see, let's catch up here with the slides. Joshua tells us in chapter 5, verses 13 through 15, that the captain of the Lord's host appeared to him. This is clearly supernatural. Though called a man, Bible students have long discussed the identity of this divine manifestation. And he asks the question, is it Jesus or an angel or someone else or something else? First, we're told that Joshua made a request of the being to identify yourself. And we see that in chapter 5, verse 14. Well, let's just read 13. When Joshua was by Jericho, he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, a man was standing before him with his drawn sword in his hand. And Joshua went to him and said to him, "Are you for us or for our adversaries?" And he said, "No, but I am the commander of the army of the Lord. Now I have come." And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and worshipped him and said to him, "What does my Lord say to his servants?" And the commander of the Lord's army said to Joshua, "Take off your sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy." And Joshua did so. We see Joshua worshiping this being, and then we're reminded, fourth, Joshua is told the very same thing that the I Am told Moses when he was commissioned to lead God's people. Where was Moses when the Lord identified himself as this I Am? Okay, at the burning bush. And he asked the Lord, who am I to tell these people that sent me to you, that sent me before you? And the answer was, I am. Tell them that I am sent you. All right. Regardless of who this messenger of Joshua is, from the Lord, the impact is the same. The God who was with Moses, who miraculously led their fathers out of Egypt across the Red Sea and through the wilderness, would deliver to the Israelites this walled city of Jericho that was thought to be the strongest, most fortified of all the Canaanite cities. Jehovah gave his chosen leader, Joshua, special instructions as to how Jericho was to be taken. And that's starting in chapter 6. And we're going to look at all of chapter 6 here just in a second, but not just yet. The only prohibition concerned the spoil, which was a curse. Now, what are we talking about when we talk about the spoil here? Pardon? Fruits of the city, Billy says. Okay, that's good. When a city was conquered, then the conqueror got basically whatever they wanted. Joshua is told that no Israelite was to take any of it. The silver, the gold, the brass, and the iron were to be taken into the Lord's treasury. No man, woman, or child was to be spared except Rahab and her family. And we looked at Rahab Wednesday evening. Joshua obeyed the Lord exactly, and Jericho was easily subdued. Joshua cursed the city and anyone who would attempt to rebuild it. Hiel, the Bethelite, later becomes a victim of this curse when he attempts to rebuild the city. And you can read about that in 1 Kings 16:34. And the walls came tumbling down, the book says. The Lord exhorted Joshua and all Israel to follow to the letter the specific instructions given by the captain of the host. The first city of Canaan was about to be given into the land of God's chosen nation. What a triumphant feeling must have filled all Israel as they witnessed the walls of mighty Jericho come tumbling down. And we're asked several questions here. What does the word Gilgal mean? Okay, I have rolled away the reproach of the Egyptians from you, from 5:18. And then we're asked the question, and again, we'll look at this in a second, but how did Canaan react to the word of Israel's approach? How did Jericho react to the word, to the knowledge that the Israelites had crossed the river and were approaching them? Fear. What'd they do? Pardon? Okay, their heart melted and they lost their spirit. And again, you know, this was something that we've looked at in Numbers and Deuteronomy. God told the people, I'm going to put the fear of you in the hearts of these Canaanites. When they hear about you, they're going to be afraid. With the Canaanites, with the Israelites camped in Gilgal, the city of Jerusalem, the city of Jericho, closed itself up. It says nobody left, nobody entered. They were getting ready to be attacked by Israel. The next question that we're asked here, what was the name of the being that appeared to Joshua here? I kind of rephrase that, and how did he describe himself? I am the captain of the Lord's host. I am the captain of the Lord's army. We read about in I didn't write the verse down there. All right, pardon? 14, 5:14. Yes, 5:14. Thank you, Lynn. Okay, and then the last question here, define the Hebrew word or the Hebrew term takah. The what? The bottom. Okay. Another word to describe this. Okay, the walls came, Mona says the walls came tumbling down without debris, and that's certainly what happened. Fall down flat. Flat is one of the words that's used to describe, to define this word, takah. Other words that are used to define it. We've talked about the word is rendered, and this was, if you're a scholar and go back to Strong's definitions very often, Strong's number, his number 8478 for this word defines that as the under part or being beneath. Flat is used in his description. Depending on who you read, this word is used either 465 or 505 times in the Old Testament. There were several numbers, Lynn. Lynn asked what were Strong's number. One number was number 8478. Now, Strong's 8480, which is only used 6 times, it's the same word, and several of those are names of cities, but here are the instances in Joshua that this term is used. From Joshua 6:5, it shall be that when they make a long blast with the ram's horn, and when you hear the sound of it, all the people shall shout with a great shout, and the wall of the city will fall flat, and the people will go up every man straight ahead. Also in chapter 6, verse 20, so the people shouted, and the priest blew the trumpets. And when the people heard the sound of the trumpet, the people shouted with a great shout, and the wall fell down flat. That's this word. So that the people went up into the city, every man straight ahead, and they took the city. This same word is used in Joshua chapter 7, verses 21 and 22, but it's used a little bit differently here. Starting with verse 21, and this is during Achan's account of his actions there. When I saw among the spoil a beautiful mantle from Shinar, and 200 shekels of silver, and a bar of gold, 50 shekels in weight, then I coveted them and took them, and behold, they are concealed in the earth inside my tent with the silver underneath it. And this is that word takah, where it's defined as underneath, or used underneath here. Verse 22, so Joshua sent messengers, and they ran to the tent, and behold, it was concealed in his tent with the silver underneath it again. And then also the author on page 9 gives a description of the word flat here for this word. All right, in our own words, bottom of page 8 here. How should we understand the statement in Joshua 10, verses 12 and 13? And I'm going to read that in just a minute. And then what is the significance of the inspired testimonial? This is what Joshua 10, starting in verse 12 and going through 14, reads from the New American Standard. Then Joshua spoke to the Lord in the day when the Lord delivered up the Amorites before the sons of Israel. And he said in the sight of Israel, O sun, stand still at Gibeon, and O moon in the valley of Ajalon. So the sun stood still, and the moon stopped, until the nation avenged themselves of their enemies. Is it not written in the book of Jashar? And the sun stopped in the middle of the sky and did not hasten to go down for about a whole day. There was no day like that before it or after it, when the Lord listened to the voice of a man, for the Lord fought for Israel. So how should we understand these verses? I heard but couldn't make out. God is Lord, okay? And as Lord, he is over his creation, okay? God's power is unlimited. Unlimited to what's the extent we see here in these passages. I'm sorry, Lynn. Okay. Okay, in Joshua's request for help, how did he, here's what I'm getting at. How did he answer Joshua's request for help. And what happened? The sun stood still. That's what I was going for. The sun stood still until Joshua was victorious. Have we ever experienced that? Never. Do we believe that? Yes. The sun stood still. This was a miraculous event where we see God fighting for his chosen nation. And remember, what are we told? What were the Israelites told time and time again about this land? It's going to be given to you. All right. Now, they did. There were obligations placed on them, but nothing they could have done would have made the sun stand still until this battle was over. Okay, rather than, I think, go through what the authors got here on page 9, if you would, I'd just like to look at chapter 6. And again, this is a story that we're all familiar with. I hope we've read it, but perhaps for those joining us online who was not able, let's look at chapter 6. And I'll be reading from the English Standard Version. Well, hold on, let me just change this. We'll use the text that the author uses. All right. Chapter 6 from the New American Standard Bible. The conquest of Jericho. Now Jericho was tightly shut because of the sons of Israel. No one went out and no one came in. The Lord said to Joshua, "See, I have given Jericho into your hand with its king and the valiant warriors. You shall march around the city, all the men of war circling the city once. You shall do so for 6 days. Also, 7 priests shall carry 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark. Then on the 7th day you shall march around the city 7 times, and the priests shall blow the trumpets. It shall be that when they make a long blast with the ram's horn, and when you hear the sound of the trumpet, all the people shall shout with a great shout, and the wall of the city will fall down flat, and the people will go up, every man straight ahead." So Joshua the son of Nun called the priest and said to them, "Take up the ark of the covenant, and let 7 priests carry 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark of the Lord." Then he said to the people, "Go forward and march around the city, and let the armed men go on before the ark of the Lord." And it was so that when Joshua had spoken to the people, the 7 priests carrying the 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the Lord went forward and blew the trumpets. And the ark of the covenant of the Lord followed them. The armed men went before the priests who blew the trumpets, and the rear guard came after the ark, while they continued to blow the trumpets. But Joshua commanded the people, saying, "You shall not shout, nor let your voice be heard, nor let a word proceed out of your mouth until the day I tell you, shout. Then you shall shout." So he had the ark of the Lord taken around the city, circling it once. Then they came into the camp and spent the night in the camp. Now Joshua rose early in the morning, and the priests took up the ark of the Lord, the 7 priests carrying the 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark of the Lord went on continually, and blew the trumpets, and the armed men went before them, and the rear guard came after the ark of the Lord, while they continued to blow the trumpets. Thus, the second day, they marched around the city once, and returned to the camp. They did so for 6 days. Then on the 7th day, they rose early at the dawning of the day and marched around the city in the same manner 7 times. Only on that day, they marched around the city 7 times. At the 7th time, when the priest blew the trumpets, Joshua said to the people, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city. The city shall be under the ban. It and all that is in it belongs to the Lord. Only Rahab the harlot and all those who are with her in her house shall live, because she hid the messengers whom we sent. But as for you, only keep yourselves from the things under the ban, so that you do not covet them, and take some of the things under the ban, and make the camp for Israel accursed, and bring trouble upon it. But all the silver and gold and articles of bronze and iron are holy to the Lord. They shall go into the treasury of the Lord." So the people shouted, and the priest blew the trumpets, and when the people heard the sound of the trumpet, the people shouted with a great shout, and the wall fell down flat, so that the people went up into the city, every man straight ahead, and they took the city. They utterly destroyed everything in the city, both man and woman, young and old, and oxen and sheep and donkey, with the edge of the sword. Joshua said to the 2 men who had spied out the land, "Go into the harlot's house and bring the woman and all she has out of there, as you have sworn to her." So the young men who were spies went in and brought out Rahab and her father and her mother and her brothers and all she had. They also brought out all her relatives and placed them outside the camp of Israel. They burned the city with fire and all that was in it. Only the silver and gold and articles of bronze and iron they put into the treasury of the house of the Lord. However, Rahab the harlot and her father's household and all she had, Joshua spared. And she has lived in the midst of Israel to this day, for she hid the messengers whom Joshua sent to spy out Jericho. Then Joshua made them take an oath at that time, saying, "Cursed before the Lord is the man who rises up and builds this city Jericho with the loss of his firstborn, and he shall lay its foundation, and with the loss of his youngest son he shall set up its gates." So the Lord was with Joshua, and his fame was in all the land. And that's the account of the fall of Jericho. We're gonna stop there for this morning. Lord willing, we'll continue this lesson Wednesday evening in our Bible class there. We've got just a moment or two for a comment. Lynn?